Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first session of this series of conferences on contemporary anti-Semitism, titled What to Think About the Jewish World After October 7th. These are conferences in French, but there is simultaneous translation that is available, and you may access it in the way that's described in the chat. This series of conferences is offered by ISGAP, the Brussels Jonathas Institute, in collaboration with UCA. My name is Barash Berkowitz, and I am a postdoctoral researcher for ISGAP and the Haifa University, the Jewish University of Budapest. And it is our honor and pleasure to have today among us Bruno Karsenti, who's a philosopher and a professor at UCHS and a member of the committee of redaction of the magazine K, and who's going to talk to us about anti-Semitism today, upcoming anti-Semitism. I'd like to remind you that the presentation is going to last about 40 minutes, after which you will have the option of asking questions for about 25 minutes at most. Thank you very much, Bruno, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. Thank you, Balázs. Thank you for inviting me. So I will introduce an analysis of what I think to be the anti-Semitism happening before our very eyes since the beginning of the years 2000s, and whose face became more clear and more precise since October 7th. So the past 2 years, we have seen this anti-Semitism, and is representing an important political actor around which the political debate in Europe and in the United States and in all of the Western world, let's say, has been organized. So I'm talking mostly from Europe, about Europe, France being the country with the biggest Jewish community in Europe. And I'm also talking from France, where I think the traces of this anti-Semitism are particularly visible. Everything I'm saying is also valid for the European situation, and I'll explain why I make a difference between Europe and the United States at the end of my presentation, both being a representation of the Western world, but these are two representations that should be distinguished at the moment. In our world, post-1945, post-Shoah, anti-Semitism has been a position very generally disproved. It is legally sanctioned, so officially it is prohibited. Anti-Semitic positions may be expressed. They usually are marginal, and they know that by being ostentatious, by expressing their anti-Semitism ostentatiously, they know that they're outlawed. It's a trivial remark. However, it is important because I think that it makes our problem salient, the lack of understanding that we have about the following facts. the reasons of the controversies that the analysis of anti-Semitism trigger, the reasons of these controversies to fight anti-Semitism are obscure. They're obscure if it is true that anti-Semitism is unanimously or quasi-unanimously fought against in our societies. Why and how then are there constant emerging controversies as to its analysis, the necessity to analyze it, the necessity to see it, the necessity to fight it? This is the first surprising fact that we have to go from to talk about anti-Semitism today in the Western world. In my opinion, the most credible hypothesis is that there is a perpetration of discomfort regarding the Jewish fact. And I'm saying that I'm speaking very generally, and I'll try to specify what it is. That's expressed in the fact that we never agree on the fact that it is indeed anti-Semitism, and the burden of proof is for Jews, it's anti-Semitism, and everything must be done to know it and to fight it. It is not obvious at all, and it is a sign that there is indeed a discomfort about Jews in European societies and Western societies as well, post-Shoah. So measuring the hatred, and talk about its seriousness and implement a policy to fight anti-Semitism, to counter anti-Semitism. That's what it's about in the controversies that are currently raging through our societies. So in these conditions, how could we give back some evidence to the fight against anti-Semitism? How could we relaunch it, impose it? I suggest, and I suggested in several texts, to go through an analysis of the discomfort itself, analyzing the discourses and about the unease about anti-Semitism, and to analyze these controversies about anti-Semitism. The sociology of controversies is an act of contemporary sociology, and we have to implement it to deal with this phenomena. Very few research centers do it, to present research, to ask for funding for research on controversies about anti-Semitism. It's a difficult task, and I was able to test it myself through my own research lab. It is not easy to impose or to make it necessary to support this type of research, and this is part of the problem. Now let's get into the problem itself. If anti-Semitism is disapproved, but yet fighting it is a subject of controversy, it means that denying anti-Semitism has become part of anti-Semitism. The fact to say that it's not anti-Semitism is part of the problem of anti-Semitism. And from this situation stems a methodology, which is as follows, and this is the one I'm going to adopt in this presentation. I will start by talking about the challenges building up against objectivization and denunciation of anti-Semitism, and then, after talking about these obstacles and this negativity, I will talk about a positive image of what is today's anti-Semitism, but only after doing this critic. You know, Kant wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, and what we have to write is that it's a critique of the reason anti-Semitic. That's where we are. We need to write politically a criticism of the anti-Semitic reason, and that's the first part of my presentation. Then, after doing this criticism, we may qualify the type of anti-Semitism we're facing. So, critique of anti-Semitic reason. First point, and it's the most general point, we cannot make anti-Semitism a public problem. The sociology of controversies, which is a subdiscipline of the sociology that has developed since the 1990s, has a hard time to see the controversies around anti-Semitism. And another branch of the sociology should be called for. It's the sociology of public problems. How do we build a public problem? And sociology knows how to describe it. You have some works that deal with the way of how historically alcoholism has become a public problem, for instance, and we should be able, given the objective rise correctly registered of anti-Semitic acts, anti-Semitic words in Europe since the beginning of the 2000s, the continual increase of these phenomena, we should be able to explain that these phenomena should be, for all of the European societies, a public problem. But the sociology of the public problems of anti-Semitism is difficult because anti-Semitism does not constitute a public problem. Do we have to wait for political leaders of the state to become a public problem? But that's not how you do things. A public problem is not built up simply with actors. Who are only political representatives. You have to have a series of actors, and in these actors, to constitute a public problem, you have not only them, but also the academia and education. So a public problem is the imposition of collective conscience of that a damage caused to such or such community from the national community is everybody's problem. That is what a public problem is. A damage caused to a segment, a part of society, concerns all of society for reasons that have to be demonstrated. It means that different actors who are not necessarily just politicians, but who are also actors of academia, of research, education, social workers, would be cooperating in order to constitute this public problem, but we're not there yet. Evidently, it hasn't happened. What is currently happening, and we can see it, is a reaction at the level of the state, of states, of political leaders. In France, this week, a bill is going to be presented to the Assembly, proposing to name and identify correctly the rise of current anti-Semitism and to implement measures in order to fight it. But we're coming back to what I already mentioned. This bill project is going to meet some challenges from a big part of the political class. It's already been announced. A big part of the left is going to prevent this bill to be voted for reasons I will mention later. But what's interesting is that the public problem cannot be constituted because sufficient agreement between different actors, here it is about political actors, but a sufficient agreement is not currently possible. This is the first point regarding hatred of the Jews. Collective conscience cannot find a common base. Second point, this block, this obstacle has to do with one main distinction which cannot be stabilized or which is also an object of controversy, of constant controversy, which is the core of the problem of the impossibility for anti-Semitism to constitute a public problem. It is the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism, which is at the core of all controversies. So this distinction between racism and anti-Semitism was implicit, but veiled by a common fight which unified collective conscience in the 80s and 90s. So we were still distinguishing both things, but both words were fought together while being differentiated in the 1980s, 1990s. But today, to re-utter this differentiation is also a controversy and preemptive. The distinction is preemptive by political sides which are opposed. So let me explain. We see a difference between racism and anti-Semitism that is claimed by a part of the political field. However, it's a distinction that's captured by the right and the right and extreme right under the pretext that Jews would be a minority who should be defended selectively, in priority, against their selected enemies, who would be the other minorities. This is the point that makes the extreme right wing defend the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism. However, they defend it with the racist in a racist optic. It defends it in order to isolate a minority within other minorities, say that it must be defended selectively and against persecutions coming from other minorities. Other minorities, mostly post-colonial minorities. This is the first obstacle that has an understanding of the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism. But the second obstacle comes from the other side of the political field, from the extreme left. The left and the extreme left, not just the extreme left, the left and the extreme left. And it consists in saying that both words belong to a single category. Racism absorbs anti-Semitism, encompasses anti-Semitism, because the identity of the people subjected to racism as well as anti-Semitism, so the victims of these two concepts. The identity of these victims is dissolved within a minority, in an identity which is a minority, that is summarized by the category of dominating. So this anti-racism that's claimed by the extreme left, but that is shared, in my opinion, by a big part of the left, this anti-racism is a vector of anti-Semitism, and that's the problem. Whether it is voluntary or involuntary, conscious or unconscious, I'm not going to get into it for now, but I can see that it's a vector of anti-Semitism, just like anti-Semitism from the extreme right is a vector of racism, okay? Anti-racism from the extreme left is a vector of anti-Semitism. And this is the problem in which we are. Anti-Semitism from the extreme right is a vector of racism. And the anti-racism of from the extreme left is a vector of anti-Semitism. So that's the situation we're in, where anti-Semitism and racism are in both positions and is favored by either position. So we can see that it is urgent to elaborate the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism. We cannot start today in the current conditions, in the 2020s, starting by saying again the universality of the fight against racism. That's not possible. We have to utter this distinction, but do it in a different way, differently from what the anti-Semites do it, which is more conducive to racism. So what is it going to mean to re-elaborate the distinction and to see again what anti-Semitism see in its history to be racism? So in its long history, anti-Semitism was articulated to racism, and it's true. So there is a debate, a historical debate here, which is sociological, and that should be led, and and some research must be done to enable us to have a good distinction. I'll leave this question on the side for now. I'll come back to it. Third point on the block, so the screens that are opposing good implementation of the fight against anti-Semitism. It is the part played by political Islam as an international doctrine in current anti-Semitism. This part can take on very different aspects. It's often with motivation that has nothing to do with Muslims or in Islam, but sometimes it can indeed tap into theological sources available in Islam. So whether we take it in its international expression or its manifestation at different national scales, denying that Islamism is a facet of anti-Semitism, of contemporary anti-Semitism, is absurd. It is absurd. On this point, again, collective conscious is slowed down in the fact of recognizing the fact that political Islam is part of contemporary anti-Semitism and the fact that it is indeed Muslim, which does not mean that it is Islam in itself that's anti-Semitic, but that it is the use of Islam schemes that is used to demonstrate judgment, anti-Semitic act and judgment. And on this point, what blocks collective conscience? This rise of Islamist arguments that undeniably gives its strength to contemporary anti-Semitism, a part of its strength to this contemporary anti-Semitism, this argument or this rise of Islamism is done in a general way and not necessarily is not necessarily just for the Muslim world. Under the pretext of anti-Zionism. So, and the impossibility to denounce the rise of Islamism is favored by the rise of anti-Zionism, which has become, these past few years, a position whose legitimacy has grown. So the point that struck us after October 7th, and that's why we can say that post-October 7th, it just really proven this phenomena, but it's a phenomena that existed before October 7th. But October 7th made visible the fact that anti-Zionism preceded the critique of Israel, the criticism of Israel. Anti-Zionism was already here and did not wait for effective acts of the Jewish state to claim its legitimacy. So again, we're very far from the 1980s and 1990s, just like for racism and anti-Semitism. With anti-Zionism, we are far from the old anti-Zionism of the 1980s, which was something done by third worldism and by the fight against colonialism, but brought back to the support to national emancipation fights of colonized and formerly colonized countries. We do not have a support for national emancipation fights here, so we're no longer at the level of third worldism. We're at the level of an anti-Zionism, which sees in Zionism the absolute synonym of colonialism as such. And therefore, of violence imposed to a people, the Palestinian people, independently from national pretension of these people, independently from the nationalization project that was carried by these people. Anti-Zionism has become something that is no longer the weapon of extreme left or left weapon. It has become the name of a sensibility to any fight, anti-colonialist, That is to say, to any fight against anything that may represent the nation state in its politics, in its post-colonial politics. So, just to sum up, we were having a problem regarding the distinction between anti-Semitism and racism. We have a similar problem here, but we have to see how this problem is different. We have to see how anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism here are correlated. What is their link? What anti-Zionism says at this radical level is that one of the poles around which the Jewish life had been organized after post-Shoah, after 1945, is guilty. In other words, one of the pillars of reconstitution of Jewish life, post-Shoah, must be destroyed. And it is at this level that its anti-Semitism must be detected. The anti-Semitism of anti-Zionism resides in the fact to refuse the reconstruction of Jewish life post-Shoah, one of the pillars that it gave itself. Now I'll come to the fourth negative point, and it is both the simplest and the most difficult to explain. So I will just say that what is at stake in the discomfort of European societies, what is manifested in its inability to make anti-Semitism a public problem, is the refusal to see who the Jews are. At the core of these difficulties, what best qualifies the current anti-Semitism, the core is that we must not see the identity of the Jews, what the Jews are specifically, see what they are not abstractly as a collective and temporal subject, but historically, in the long European history and shorter European history, which is that of its reconstruction after 1945. In other words, discomfort resides within the fact that something cannot be seen by European societies, and specifically Western societies, in what happened after the Shoah and in what became the Jews, or became again the Jews, in the post-Shoah era. And that's what I would like to try and explain quickly. And that's where the United States and Europe are different in the way they see the problem. What happened in the post-Shoah era for the Jews? What happened after the destruction of two-thirds of the Jewish people by the Shoah? What happened was that a Jewish life was reconstructed in Europe all the same, under two conditions. The first condition was that the European states, little by little, made the fight against anti-Semitism one of its major axes. In other words, there was indeed, when they denounce post-colonialism, they're right, but there was indeed, after the Shoah, the acceptation by Europe that this crime was not comparable to other crimes, that this crime was specific because it had implied European self-destruction. And by killing the Jews, Europe had been self-impacted, had been engaged in a process in which it took the risk of killing itself. That is the first aspect of post-Shoah European history, the fact that the Jews were able to think that they belong to Europe from the moment Europe recognized and made its own politics. So the fight against anti-Semitism was from then on a central axis, and it could never again be a project, a desirable project, if the fight against anti-Semitism was not present in it. Then, second condition for the reconstruction, Israel. Israel, as being recognized by Western society and by Europe as the other necessary pillar of Jewish life. So, not just adhering to Zionism, but a credit given to Zionism on the one hand, and on the other hand, a fight, a central fight against anti-Semitism. That is the condition for Jews to be able to remain in Europe, but it's also the condition for Europe to reconstruct. It's exactly at the end of this process that we are started in the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, and what we're currently living with the incapacity to name anti-Semitism. What we're currently living is the fact that this history of the Jews and of Europe post-Shoah has reached its term. So, I think that it is the last screen. We don't want to see the history of the Jews, and so, just like we have to reconstitute the distinction between racism and anti-Semitism, in the same manner, we have to be able to link anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Third condition for a reconstruction is to redo the history of the Jews in their European history, in which Shoah is a major threshold, but where Shoah intervenes in the long history of modern Jews, of the emancipation, of European construction, and the history then starts again after 1945, putting the Jews at the core of its reconstruction and putting Israel as a support to this reconstruction. So Israel is linked to Europe. So now you understand why I need to distinguish Europe and the United States to understand this situation. The United States have become the biggest Jewish center, the biggest Jewish diaspora. And yet, from an ideological point of view, from a memorial point of view, the matter of the maintain of a Jewish life in Europe has one main condition. I know, Bash, I can see you. I think I almost... have no more time. Yeah, you can continue for 5 more minutes. So I'll finish in 5 minutes. So now, from these points, from these negative points, can we define the emerging anti-Semitism? It's not so much the emerging anti-Semitism, it's the anti-Semitism we've been in since the beginning of the years 2000s, and that has become more precise since October 7th. Yes, we can because we can see that this anti-Semitism has a specific trait. And it is not the fact that the Jews are corrupting national communities, not like in classic anti-Semitism, not like, you should hate Jews because they want to be separated, just as in anti-Judaism, which was anterior to modern anti-Semitism. But the Jews are hateable by their persistence, the fact that they persist as Jews. And they say the necessary persistence of Europe with the Jewish question in its core, that's what has become absolutely unbearable from big parts of public opinion. And so the stakes today, and we saw that immediately after October 7th, the way that the refusal to see the Jewish victims and the way the portraits of the hostages were taken away from the walls where they were being displayed, showed a hatred of the Jewish persistence, of the way they appear in the public spaces. And I think that is the deepest aspect of contemporary anti-Semitism. It is an anti-Semitism whose active on American anti-Semitism should have its own portrait, and I don't have time to talk about it now, which is also linked to persistence, but otherwise, the core of what I'm describing is European, and we live in an anti-Semitism that is all the more difficult to fight as the actors of this anti-Semitism can sincerely or duplicitly say that they're not anti-Semitic. I am done. I finished. Thank you very much. Thank you for this extremely interesting presentation that summarized the main problem in a very concise way. So I think there will be a lot of questions. If you have any questions, you may raise your hand. Yes? I'm not seeing any questions yet. Okay, so I am going to ask a question, give the others the opportunity of thinking about some questions. So, regarding the criticism of the anti-Semitic reason, these are extremely important points. The fact that anti-Semitism is assimilated to racism. There's a methodological question, a political question. The problem of anti-Semitism for the left or the extreme left, this specificity, this type of specificity that the left cannot stand, and the fact that it is mixed into racism as universal racism, a hostility against all minorities. So the Jews must not claim some exception. So that's already one point. But the second point can be that the definition of racism that you already mentioned is that racism is defined in terms of social dominion, in terms of a social hierarchy, and in this hierarchy, the Jews are considered to be in the dominating sides. So we can see that anti-Semitism is assimilated in racism, but it constitutes only a subgroup. Anti-Semitism is a subgroup of racism. But that's empty. Yes, exactly. It's not populated. There's no anti-Semitism. There's no racism against Jews. There is, but it's not structured. So it is not a social phenomena that's important at the end of the day. You're right. It's like an empty box. Anti-racism that supposedly encompasses anti-Semitism is an empty box because the definition criterion of this is to be dominated. And so if it is to be dominated, indeed, the way the Jews can present themselves as victims of racism is deprived of the criterion itself. I'd like to say something, nonetheless, regarding this point, which in my opinion is not often noted. It's that racism encompasses a logic which happens at a certain time of the history of the Jews. There was a racial moment in anti-Semitism directed against Jews, and we may say that this racial time really is a modern time. It's a time when the Jews were victims of biological characterization, but this was done in a scope where they were not being dominated. They were subject to national hatred. They were victims of national hatred. So what they were victims of were policies in the name of the nation. So either state policies, such as Nazism for Vichy, or group politics, such as when anti-Semitic parties would declare their hatred of the Jews in the name of biological characterization of this population. So it was a racism that was not exactly centered on dominion. It was centered on the purification of the nation. So actually, the problem of new racism, you cannot really describe new anti-Semitism if you don't describe new racism. It's the way racism has evolved in the form of a perception of being dominated without any dominant agents, without identifiable agents such as a nation state, which exerts this violence. So, what is dominion for? It is to talk about your illegitimate inferiority, but it also enables to not pose the problem of integration to a national body, you see. In other words, new racism is not political in the same sense that it was when the Jews were victims of racism, which is the constitution of a national body which had to exclude them as a race. So racism has also changed, and that's the problem. We must also describe the change in racism. May I ask a question? Can you hear me? Yes, of course. I see a question in the chat. Yeah, there are several about persistence. On the one hand, I'd like to understand how you reach that conclusion that would be extremely pessimistic to the extent that anti-Semitism is also the persistence of the Jewish fact in Europe. The only way to eliminate it would be to remove this persistence. And on the other hand, I feel like whatever forms anti-Semitism has, it's always a matter of persistence. And so your conclusion does not really describe the new forms of anti-Semitism. It just gives a general concept. And before 1940, it was the same thing. And in the days of Dreyfus, it was the same thing. So what do these people do who are still here and who still are perduring? But the new form, which is anti-Zionism, from the extreme left, along with a series of anti-colonialists and so forth, is, after all, the explanation today. Yeah, you're right, and I need to specify what I mean by persistence to really qualify the time post 2000. You're right. Actually, the matter of persistence, generally speaking, has always existed, has always been here in the former forms of anti-Semitism. What do I mean by anti-Semitism that's exclusively centered on this question? The problem is that the Jews' persistence is that of Europe, and that's what's new. The concept of persistence for the Jews is both for the Jews and for Europe. And what is hated in the Jewish persistence by a big part of European opinion is its own persistence. Do you understand what I mean, sir? Yes, I understand word per word, but I don't understand how your own persistence of European opinion or just a part of it. Let me specify. European persistence post-1945 was not obvious at all. European nation states committed a crime which questions again its own project at the root. In order to perdure, Europe had to again be linked to the Jews, maybe for the first time consciously, by saying European Jews will no longer be persecuted, or when they are persecuted, Europe will rise in order to prevent this. Again, there were two conditions: political, internal politics, and a link to Zionism, which would be a link to Israel. So persisting in Europe, persisting for Europe, was enabling the Jews to perdure in Europe. Do you understand? So it has two sides. It's European consciousness and Jewish consciousness. The minute the colonial question happened in the way that the European question was rephrased, Europe with colonialism experienced a fundamental questioning of its persistence, you see. And in this device, the Jews were caught in the middle because they were rejected from the persistence side. Europe did not want anymore.
C'est devenu très clair.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
Mais ça voudrait dire que
So that
pour
would mean
éliminer
that in order to eliminate
l'antisémitisme, il faut que
anti-Semitism,
l'Europe accepte
Europe would have to
sa
accept
propre
its
persistance et
own
fasse le
persistence
deuil de sa mauvaise conscience par
and
rapport au
remove its
colonialisme et
own
par rapport
bad
au nationalisme.
conscience
Pour moi, c'est
in
l'enjeu
terms of
central.
colonialism. Absolutely.
Ça se passe
These are
avec
the
la
main
conscience
stakes.
postcoloniale.
That
C'est pour
happens
ça que je
with the
pense qu'on ne
post-colonial
peut pas
conscience.
dire que ça
That's
n'a
why I
pas
think
existé.
you
Le
can't say it did
colonialisme
not
a connu
exist.
ses crimes.
Colonialism
La
did
conscience
commit some
postcoloniale
crimes,
a droit
and post-colonial
à
conscience
un
is
auto-examen et un
entitled
auto-examen de
to a
l'Europe. Mais elle ne
self-examination
peut
from
pas
Europe,
être
but it
une
cannot
cause
be
du
a
renoncement à la
cause of
persistance d'Europe.
Tout à fait. Et la
renouncing
base du
European
raisonnement devrait
persistence. And
être
the basis
celle
of
du
the
droit pénal,
reasoning
que
should be that
un fils
of
ne peut être tenu
criminal
responsable des crimes de son
law,
père,
saying that
et
a
par
son
conséquent que les
cannot be
générations actuelles européennes,
responsible
qui sont d'ailleurs en
of
grande partie
his father's crime.
ou en partie composées de coloniaux,
And
de
since
personnes venant des colonies,
it's composed
n'ont
of a lot
plus
of people coming from
Coupable
colonies. Yeah,
exactement.
exactly.
Mais évidemment,
But of
à une
course,
condition que la mémoire postcoloniale se constitue comme
post-colonial
une mémoire européenne.
memory
Voyez
must be constituted
oui,
as a
donc c'est un
European
négationnisme.
Voilà, c'est un travail
conscience.
sur les
Yes,
mémoires
it's
là
a
qui est
work on the
et on ne
memory
s'en
that's at
sortira pas. Les
stake.
Juifs ne s'en
And the
sortiront
Jews
pas
will
si
not
ce
get
travail
out
n'est
of
pas
it
fait.
if this work is not done.
Voilà.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Il y a d'autres questions dans le chat.
Any other questions in
Il y
the
a Danny
chat?
Trom. Tu posais ta question, Danny?
Danny Trump, do you want to ask your question?
Oui.
Yes.
Moi, c'est sur Bruno.
Danny. Yeah,
le point sur racisme,
it was the point about racism and anti-Semitism.
Il me semble que
it seems that anti-Semitism, modern anti-Semitism,
qui suit l'émancipation,
which follows the
pas
emancipation,
celui qui suit l'émancipation,
the one following emancipation,
toujours la forme
always takes the form of something that looks like a movement of liberation, and that's where there is a difference, which is almost the antithesis of racism. I would be tempted to say that there's an antinomy between both. Just because Nazism, just because with Nazism, anti-Semitism become an a racial form. What the Nazis wanted to do was to be liberated from the Jews. They didn't want to dominate them. They were the ones that were dominated. And anti-Semitism is always a problem of domination of a minority by a majority. It's always a majority that's dominated by a minority. And I think that it's a scheme that's constant, that's consistent in anti-Semitism, in post-emancipation anti-Semitism. And I find that we yield too much to our peers, fighting peers. It's not a general question of persistence. I agree with that, but we have an alliance problem, and this alliance cannot function the minute that it's not recognized. We yield too much by saying, yeah, okay, it's true, the Jews are a minority. They're a numeric minority. They're a minority in numbers, but they're a much dominating majority, which is not numeric, but which is in every way dominating. And anti-Semitism did not make a lot of efforts to recognize it. In actuality, it is indeed dominion, and even for Nazism, it was not limited to Germany. It was a general liberation. Yes, for all Europe. And beyond. Okay, so that's part of our discussion, and it is good to include that into the equation, to add that to the equation. These are reflection bases on the critique of critics. So let me tell you why I want to continue talking about the Jews as a minority and why the matter of racism. I agree on the fact that there's no link, there's no structural link between racism and anti-Semitism, but there was a conjuncture link, and this link, what was it about? So I am very impressed with, I was convinced, in fact, by the Yerushalmi Shab genealogy, which is the racism genealogy as whose first efficient operator in 15th century Spain. So the idea of the status of blood purity, where you would have the first real modern racist scheme, which then, and which had on the Jews, which was illustrated on the Jews. Why? Because Jews, it was Yerushalmi who made this point in one of his texts, and then indeed it was very well developed and illustrated by John Friedrich Schott's work. It's the matter of what the Jews can't get rid of. It's a matter of what baptism itself may not erase and what is being transmitted by blood. And so they can do whatever they want. It's not going to be erased. This is a properly racial operator. It escapes individual will. And so what did it mean for the Jews? For other populations, we can see visible characteristics, visible traits, or moral traits which are impossible to stop, but for the Jews it manifested itself differently. What happened is that they are all the more hateable as they're invisible. You see what I mean? I can't hear you, Dan. You're on mute. Okay, but it's precisely because they're invisible that they climb in societies. Yeah, so it's social ascension. And so we find they're part of a majority. But the question of dominion is encompassed in that. Yes, exactly. And so you cannot completely separate the scheme because what does racial scheme say? It says they can't help it. Okay, but the dominion cannot be separated from the matrix towards the Jews. Correct. It's not the blacks who escalate in society. They can't because they can be seen. No, I agree. But what I'm telling you is that you cannot completely detach the racist reasoning. You cannot completely detach it. It all depends where you put the focus, what you put the focus on when you characterize anti-Semitism. Maybe we just have time for one last question, if we can have a really quick answer. What is the place in this picture, the sociological negation of Oriental Jews? Of this ethnical purification included in the justification of decolonization. I agree with that, with the negation of their history. For European Jews, what does this imply? for European Jews, what I didn't say, and which is quite important in the fact that it was reconstructed after 45, it's the part played by immigration, post-colonial Jewish immigration in the reconstitution of Jewish, European Jewish persistence starting in the 1960s. First of all, empirically speaking, but what was the destiny, the fate of this Oriental Jewish population? They already had a European history, and that's the point. Among the post-colonial populations, it has a history that was more European. I'm thinking mostly about Algerian Jews, but not only in Tunisia and Morocco. A history that was more European than other post-colonial populations. So there would be a broadening of the history of the Jewish fact in Europe that would be a finer way to read post-colonial history than the one that is demanded now by post-colonials. But indeed, I completely agree. It is a dimension of the question, and it may be even a strategic dimension to approach the question that this gentleman asked on persistence. Can you hear me? Yes. Indeed, I find it very interesting the fact that it is inscribed in the evolution of anti-Semitism. But it seems to me that given the theme of this anti-Semitism, I feel like you're not including an element that seems fundamental to me. It's the resurgence of anti-Semitism from the political development that happened in Israel, and with all the consequences and everything that's linked to war phenomena. I'm thinking about October 7th and beyond. Israeli politics, which I feel was the trigger of anti-Semitism, of renewed anti-Semitism, and which seems to be one of the main hooks of what will become, of what should become the fight against future anti-Semitism. You're right, I did not talk about Israel very much. Well, I am against the idea, against the statement that says that anti-Semitism as being developed since the early 2000s is caused by Israeli politics development. I don't think it's true. I think that it's an anti-Semitism that does not need Israel and Israeli politics, such as it is, to increase. But that is the first proposition. It has causes that are internal to that's European fate, and that's enough to increase in this way and leave the Palestinian cause and injustices that Palestinians are subjected to objectively preoccupy European conscience so much. It means that the internal causes are dominant. That's the premise. That's what I believe. Now, you have the question of what is becoming Israel. Let me tell you how I understand the way it is in the equation. If we go from post-Shoah consciousness with the double persistence of the Jews and Europe and the Jews in Europe, and in the world, this double persistence with two conditions, fight against
constituant un axe central de la politique
anti-Semitism,
européenne d'un côté, le soutien à l'existence
support
d'Israël, à ce que
so-
représente
supporting the
Israël,
existence of Israel and what it
si on a
represents on the
cette
other hand,
politique, si on l'admet.
if we admit it.
Il y a quand même quelque chose
There is
qui
something
pèse sur Israël.
that weighs on
Qu'est-ce
Israel.
qui pèse sur
And
Israël?
what is that?
D'être un pays
The fact it is a country
qui accueille les Juifs
that welcomes
s'ils en
Jews
ont besoin
if
et
they
s'ils le
need
veulent.
it and if they want.
Donc, l'État abri. Et donc, qui,
It's a
en ce
shelter
sens,
state. And
participe
in this sense, it participates in
la lutte
the
contre
fight against
l'antisémitisme
anti-Semitism
en Europe et
in
dans le monde,
Europe and in the world,
qui en est un pilier étatique
which is a state pillar
et qui en
of
est
it,
le pilier
and which is
si particulier que
such a specific pillar of it that there can be no Jewish no persecution against the Jews in it. It's impossible since they're the majority there.
Mais
But
pour qu'Israël
in order for
corresponde
Israel
à cette exigence,
to
pèse sur
answer
Israël
this
le fait
demand,
d'être un
what
État
weighs
de
on
droit
Israel is the fact
conforme
that
aux
it's
standards
a
européens. C'est
straight
absolument
state
nécessaire. Ça peut pas être
in
un État
compliance
d'une
with
autre nature
European
que ces
no,
États européens
standards.
qui
It cannot
l'admettent
be another
dans le
nature,
concert, pas dans l'entité européenne, mais cet appui extérieur à l'Europe
but
pour qu'elle persiste. Il est
it
nécessaire
has to be
que
compliant with Europe in order to
Israël se constitue
remain.
en un État de droit de même
It has to
nature.
be a straight state of the same
C'est
nature.
pour ça qu'il n'y avait rien d'absurde à demander.
That's why it
que,
wasn't absurd
comme l'avait demandé
to
Joseph
ask.
Dany,
I know,
qui avait
Danny, you
personnage
like this
Panella,
character, Panella.
demandé
Panella asked
Israël fasse partie de l'Union
for
européenne.
Israel
Il y
to
avait
be
rien
part of the
d'absurde là-dedans
European
parce que
Union.
ça ne faisait
It
que
was
pousser
not
à la
absurd
limite un raisonnement qui était historiquement
because it was
valide.
a reasoning that was historically valid.
Maintenant, dès
Now,
lors
the
que
minute
il y a un problème
there's a
au niveau
problem
des droits des minorités
at the level of the rights of
en Israël.
minorities in Israel,
Et donc, dès lors que la
the
question des
minute
Palestiniens
the
devient
Palestinian question
seulement la
becomes not
question
only
de l'injustice
the question of
d'une cause
injustice
nationale empêchée dans son
for a
développement,
national
hein,
cause
mais,
prevented in its
euh,
development,
une injustice
but
subie
an
de
injustice
la
that
par
they're victim
une
of
minorité de cet état de droit qu'est
by
Israël.
a minority of this straight
À partir de ce moment-là, on a vraiment,
state
monsieur,
that
effectivement,
Israel
un
is.
problème.
Then we
C'est-à-dire, on
indeed
a
have a
le problème
problem.
de
We
ce
have the
que
problem
ça se défait. Donc
that
ce que je vous ai
things are
décrit se
going to
défait par deux
unravel
voies. Se défait par l'effacement
because
de la
of the
conscience
erasure
post-Shoah
of post-Shoah
dans l'histoire de
consciousness
l'Europe,
in
et se
the
défait par
European
dérive
history,
de
and by the fact
l'État
that
d'Israël dans autre chose que
the
ce que
Israeli
le
states
sionisme avait représenté pour
is
l'Europe.
derived in something
Je
else.
répondrai
So
oui
I will answer yes
à la question.
to the
Il y a une cause
question.
israélienne.
There is an Israeli
Cette cause
cause. This
israélienne,
Israeli
faut bien,
cause,
être prudent sur la
we
manière
have
dont
to
on
be
la
very
nomme,
careful in the way we name it and we qualify it. And so
la critique là
the
sur
criticism must, the critic must
constitution
be
d'Israël, le
on the
maintien
constitution and
d'Israël
maintain
dans
of
le régime d'un État
Israel,
de droit qui
the
respecte
regime of a
ses
state,
minorités.
of the right
Voilà.
of right state that respect its
beaucoup.
minority. Thank you
Merci à
very
tous,
much. Thank you
pour
everyone
votre
for your
participation.
participation.
Merci
Thank you,
énormément à Bruno Karsenti,
Bruno
pour cette
Karsenti, for this
présentation.
presentation.
On se retrouve le 5
And we'll see
février
you again on
avec
February
la
5th
présentation de
with
Joël
Joël
ainsi que Jonathan
Kutek's
Husser.
presentation.
Merci encore et
Thank you
au revoir.
again. Goodbye.
Merci.
Thank
Merci.
you. Thank you.
Merci à vous.